Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Yuvan Gao, and I'm a core faculty member in the School of Landscape Architecture at the Boston Architecture College. The BAC is distinguished for its leadership in educating a diverse student body and advancing social equity through the design of landscapes, architecture, interior spaces, sustainable environment, historic preservation, and spaces for human health. Supported by our exceptional practitioners and faculty, we lead integration of practice-based learning through academic study. We're committed to transforming our design program to reach an even broader and more diverse student body, empowering them to realize their full potential without boundaries. Tonight, we're honored to welcome our guest speaker, Glen Valentine. This evening's event is the third in the spring 2025 Just Futures lecture series, sponsored in part by Eastern Savings Bank. Glen is a principal at Stimson's Cambridge studio and brings over 30 years of experience to his practice. He's a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and a registered landscape architect in Massachusetts. Glen has a particular interest in exploring the expressive and sculptural potential of landforms as they relate to unique programs and environmental conditions. In recent years, he has focused on bringing innovative and sensitive landscape to historic campuses such as MIT, Harvard, and Boston College, as well as to public parks such as Doan Brook and Lincoln Park. His work includes award-winning campus and institutional master plans, public parks, and private residence. In today's lecture, Glen will examine parks and public spaces in Boston, Cleveland, and Albany, posing a critical question. When we build a public park, who does it serve? He will also explore whether expectations were met or fell short, and ultimately, whether justice was served and for whom. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Glen Valentine. Thank you.
All right. Can you guys hear me all right? All right. Well, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you all about my work and some parks in Boston and some other places that I'm going to dive right into. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our firm. We're a firm of two studios, one in Boston in Inman Square, about 22 people, where I work, spend most of my time. That's the image on the right on your screen here. Sitting around this long table. We have like a 30-foot long table in the middle of the studio where we do a lot of our shredding and a lot of our design studies. And it's a wonderful place to work. We also have a rural studio in Princeton, Massachusetts. That's the image you see on your left. And this is pretty much the whole firm. We're about 40 people. All landscape architects, except for a few administrative people who help us run the firm. And out on this, in the Princeton studio, we really see that as a landscape lab. We do a lot of full-scale mock-ups out there. And we also have a functioning nursery where we teach young employees about what it takes to grow a tree, maintain a tree, and even dig a tree. So really getting some practical hands-on experience with the materials we use to design. We really have a strong emphasis on craft in the office. This is a retreat we took for a week at the Haystack Mountain Craft School in Maine. It was really a wonderful experience. It's the first time we've done it. We hope to repeat it. There we spent 4 days making clay bowls, wooden spoons, and other tools, and even steel implements in the blacksmith shop, and really using our hands. And that translates in our work really to an appreciation of the craftsmen that we work with, the masons, the landscape contractors, everyone who we collaborate with in building landscapes. It also translates to the act of drawing. That's a sketch on the right, which is very typical for our studio, very loose, quick sketch. And it's these kind of drawings that we continuously generate that really capture the spirit of projects we're working on and help to drive them forward. The range of our work is pretty broad. We work from everything from a very large scale of public parks. That's Hardberger Park there on the left in San Antonio, Texas. That's a view looking down on a wildlife bridge, one of the largest in the country, that's designed to be wide enough to support both humans crossing over the highway and animals at the same time. We've recently seen bobcats crossing there, so we're excited to see it's really functioning pretty well. We also work quite a bit on residences. And that image right there on the right-hand side is a residence that I just finished outside of Newport, Rhode Island. And it's a modernist house, really centered and built around a large stormwater swale. Really wonderful project with great green roofs, and really lucky to work on this project. And in our office, we feel it's very important to continue this residential practice as a place to develop design details and refine ideas that often will come out then again in public park work or some of our larger institutional work. For tonight's talk, I decided to look at 5 different spaces, and most of them are in Boston, 4 of them in the Boston area, 1 in Cleveland, mostly because I wanted to give you guys the chance, once you hear me talk a little bit about them, to go out and see these spaces for yourself. I feel that's really important to proof test a space and really experience it in real life. And it also gave me the chance to go back and look at the parks and spaces that I've designed over the past 30 years and just really see how they're working and bring that back to you guys. The words you see here are what I feel are the most important elements for, or ideas or concepts for each one of these spaces that really drove who got to use these spaces in the end. I'm going to start with fences and start with a park many of you may or may not know down in Chinatown. This is Mary Suhu Park. It's a very small park right next to the Chinatown Gate, and it was an extremely complicated project to build. And it was not only technically complicated because it's built over the central artery, but it was very complicated because of the client. It's probably the most multi-headed client I've ever worked with. It was the primary client was the BRA, the planning agency working there at the time, but we were also working with the Parks Department, who was maintaining this. The property was owned by the Department of Transportation, and we were working with the Chinatown community, many aspects of that, the Leather District community, the business downtown or financial center of the city would come and eat lunch here too. We also had the Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy as an important client who was slated to take over this park once it was built. And the family of Mary Suhu, the park was named after her. They were an integral part of the design process, and also a large population of homeless that was using this park. We started the process out by doing something we call a beauty contest in some of our public engagement processes, where you just put images out on boards and tables and you get people to vote on things that they like. It's a very good way to get people, gauge people's idea of what they want, what they like, their aesthetic preferences or the programmatic preferences. But in this particular process, most, or at least half of the people did not speak English. So we had translators working with us. So the communication was a little bit tricky right from day one. Once we went through that process of really assessing what people wanted, what the community was interested in building in this space, doing our own analysis, of course, we started to develop a series of different design options and present them to the community. But I have to say we weren't getting too much traction or consensus about the ideas. It was a tough process going through. We moved into these kind of renderings, very typical kind of Photoshop renderings of some of the spaces. This is an image here of the area where we designed gaming tables and benches where people could gather. And this is an image of an idea of play mounds that we were designing based on the idea of 7 sacred mountains in Chinese folklore. And we thought in particular this space might work to unite the front side of the garden on the surface artery road with the Hudson Street side of the park through that space. But as I mentioned, we were having trouble gaining traction and really getting consensus amongst the participants in the park. So we moved pretty quickly into building a model. This is a rough study model, but we ended up doing a bunch of these rough study models as a way to convey the idea to the people coming to the public meetings. And we started to really get some success in building consensus. This is us meeting with the 3 daughters of Mary Suhu. This was a separate kind of track, working with them to decide how their mother could be memorialized in this park. She was instrumental in the transformation of this entire neighborhood from what was a combat zone into a wonderful cultural district that it is today. Mary Sue, who had a collection of chickens, which she loved. So we decided to use those, work with her daughters as a kind of embodiment of the family within this park and tell the story of her family through these chickens, which were then engraved on granite mounds. Here is us out on the site looking at these at full-scale mock-ups made out of cardboard in the park. These granite mounds, something we typically do in this process. The thing really most importantly to note in this image, you can see how the park at the time was divided by a chain link fence, but also this monument here on the right-hand side of your screen. We didn't think too much of it. It's a monument to the students killed at Tiananmen Square. And we kind of, oh, that's a component of the park, but we didn't quite realize how important it was. We brought our models back to the larger community through these community meetings, and we still really could not get consensus. We had a lot of trouble getting the people to focus on the design of the park. And at one particularly contentious public meeting, which you see here, we came to the realization that what the people in the room were most interested in was that monument. Half the people wanted it removed completely from the park. They thought it was an embarrassment. The other half thought the park should be named in honor of the students of Tiananmen Square. And we realized in that moment that we were not going to be able to solve this problem in a public meeting. And thankfully, the leaders of the Chinatown community kind of took this offline and worked it out and allowed us to move forward in the process. But it was really eye-opening that we thought we were presenting design ideas when we were really fighting a political battle we didn't even realize was going on in this room. So here we got the park built, long story short, and you can see what we ended up doing with the monument there down in the right-hand side of your screen. We kind of had it perched right on the edge of the park, so it's sort of in the park and on the edge of the park as well. That was a compromise that worked. The other thing you can see here is a major part of the design was this 60-foot tall vent stack, which supplies the central artery underneath. And this was a tiny piece of land really divided by this vent stack, and we used it as an opportunity to bring art from the MFA. This is a little Chinese painting in the MFA, about 24 inches long, and blow it up to the 60-foot scale and wrap it around. We were really excited about this because we felt like it kind of created a landscape for the Chinatown Arch to inhabit. And we thought it was a great opportunity because there's 6 or 7 of these all the way in pairs along the Rose Kennedy Greenway to become signifiers of each one of those communities. Maybe it'll happen someday, hopefully. Here are those mounds. You can see how the chickens kind of morph with the baby chickens, kind of like the Partridge Family, and they talk about the growth of Mary Suhu's family, and you can see how they worked to blend the 2 sides of the parks together through this space from Hudson Street over to the surface road. However, oh, and here's a child climbing on those mounds, and kids love to run up and down them and utilize them. And the park, it was very successful. And I should note, there's this red fence in the background is a very iconic component of the park, and we rebuilt it. Funding was tricky for this park, and it was part of the defining characteristic of the outside of the park. And it was very successful, and a lot of use came to these tables. A lot of older men and women from the community and people of all ages really used it very heavily. However, as time went by and maintenance was taken over by the Greenway Conservancy, there's a really problem with the homeless and continuous clashes between homeless and the other people using the park. And they kind of camped out on those mounds and made them their ground, their home. And after some time, the Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy decided that those mounds had to go. Very sad moment in the life of a design and as a landscape architect. And you can see that this red fence was put back up, dividing the park once again. So I went down there recently just to take a look at this park, a couple days ago, in fact, and see how it was functioning and just get a gauge of it. And here you can see on the Hudson Street side, almost 70 people crammed into this space. It's really heavily used. And I've been told it's the most heavily used park in Boston. And I've been told by other people that it's really very much the thriving heart of the Chinatown community, like their living room where they come to. However, on the other side, this red fence, which we put in as part of it, has been extended by the Conservancy around the entire space. And there's a large sign in the middle of it, which now says no one admitted into this space unless accompanied by a child. And it's a tough situation. You can see directly across from it in the large plaza of Chinatown Park, you have these big structures and kids are playing there. So it's a big challenge to try and get people to come into this space and use it in relation to this large open space across the way. And you can see what it effectively doing is keeping that homeless population out of the park. And I don't want to disparage the Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy in any way. They're an absolute blessing for the city of Boston. And this is a very difficult problem. The homeless population of the city are never brought to that table day one. So how you deal with them and make them users of the park is a sticky problem that we all have to deal with as designers. The next one I'm going to talk about is ramps. And I threw this in just because as I was looking at these projects, I realized a lot of them were based on access. And a lot of our work is now going in and figuring out how to put in accessible ramps into various landscapes. I wanted to give you guys a look at a park I got to work on years ago with Doug Reed and Gary Hildebrand. This is the Leventritt Garden at the Arnold Arboretum. And it's really a space that's designed around one continuous ramp. And it shows you kind of the power of ramps and thinking of accessible circulation as a generative idea of a design rather than solving the problem of how you get around the space. You go into this space and you have this wall on your left-hand side, which starts out at 6 inches high. By the time you get down to the level space, it's 8 feet high, kind of swallows you up like the Vietnam Memorial. And it's this wonderful arc going out down into the garden. And once you get to the center of the garden, the ramps, they scissor back and forth up into the adjacent spaces and adjacent collections on either side of the center of this greensward. And really, you don't need to use the steps at all. They kind of become a sculptural decoration in this space. You can travel through the whole space in a much more interesting way, going up and down ramps and turning 90 degrees to the main axis. Then when you get to this space and turn around and look down, again, the ramp continues sweeping down into the rest of the Arnold Arboretum. And I'd recommend you go there now in the winter when nothing is in bloom. It's really wonderful to see the structure and the bones of the garden. Now, I did this when I was quite young. I was a project manager. Oh, another reason to go there, got this in there, is really to see the plants. And the idea of these vines on these panels just worked out so well. Each one of them becomes this incredible kind of abstract sculpture, almost like a line drawing. This is an early picture of the garden before anything grew up. And when it was done, I was like, don't touch it. Don't plant anything. I don't want to lose any of this beautiful sculpture. But of course, if you go there today, it's a very different experience. You get swallowed in this fantasy land of plants. And it's like, a huge maze. So it's really a pretty incredible place to go visit. The next place I'm going to talk to is a place at Boston College. It's called the Pine Tree Preserve. And this open space came about as in response to a concern for safety and overcoming that concern for safety. This is that triangular island you see there is the Pine Tree Preserve. Before it was a Pine Tree Preserve, you can see two reservoirs here. The one in the background is the Chestnut Hill Reservoir, and the one in the foreground is currently where BC's football stadium is. There used to be twin reservoirs up there, big, they were like two butterfly wings. This got completely filled in, and as BC filled this in and grew, this little triangle of land remained, and it remained because Boston Sewer and Water built one of their aqueducts from the Quabbin underneath this island, and this is an access shaft to that. So it's a critical piece of infrastructure for the city of Boston, so important that they decided to fence it off about 100 years ago. And it looked like this for 100 years, just maintained so that the Boston Sewer and Water could get in there if there was ever a problem with that critical aqueduct. But we really saw it as an opportunity for BC. It's situated between the new recreation center, football, and some recreational fields, really a wellness and kind of athletic center for the students. That white building is a recreation center, which is, as any of you know who's been at a campus like this, is really the social hub of the campus now. And this triangle here is the Pine Tree Preserve, which used to be surrounded by water. And it sits, we saw it as potentially as kind of keystone in the middle of this health and wellness campus. And to the right, also, you have the Chestnut Hill Reservoir. So kind of a door to this large public open park and green space as well. We envisioned it really as an idea of a heart of mental health for students on the campus. Students, as you know, you guys are students, get stressed out. And we thought the idea of this forest with a meandering pathway going through it, we really thought of it as a contemporary labyrinth, this one winding pathway up to the top. And we pitched that to BC and tried to convince them that they should, they should build it. The president of the school said, no way, we're not going to do this. This is this crazy dense forest. It's never going to be safe. I'm not sending the kids in there. But we did a whole series of sections like this and showed him, and took a number of walks through the forest with him, showed him how that if we cleared that understory between like 2 feet and 7 feet of all the invasive vegetation that was in there, brought back just kind of selected understory trees and really pretty comprehensive lighting, that we told them you could see it even from all the sidewalks all the way to the top of the space. It'd be easy to monitor and really be quite safe. It took a long time. We walked through this space with Father Leahy a number of times, and finally we convinced him. Went forward and protected all these wonderful trees. We had to take quite a few out, really, to get that level of transparency we wanted. And here you see the protection of the trees, some of the pathways going in, and some of the boulders that were excavated as part of that earthwork process. In the end, this kind of wonderful forest of just these tall trunks of trees was revealed as all that understory invasive material came out. And then we planted this kind of carpet of native ferns and sedges throughout the park space, really to make it feel lush, and a whole series of understory trees to bring that diversity back into the space. And you can see some of the lighting along these paths too. It's really imperative that they had a very strong series of lights throughout the park. And the sort of the crown jewel of the space is this knoll at the top with these cathedral-like pines and oaks at the top. And you can see by clearing that space out, you have vistas down the hillside, down into the Chestnut Hill Reservoir in the back. It's really pretty wonderful space. And it's got just a couple benches, but some of these stones up there as well. And you can see the lighting has been pretty effective, and it's pretty heavily used both by students and the adjacent community, even into the evening hours. We put a sign at the top that shows a picture of those paired reservoirs back from 100 years ago and explains the story. We were much happier about this sign put at the entrance, which says owned by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Partnership of Boston College, Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, open to the public. So we were thrilled at this transformation of this space and really that it could be a model for all these other institutions around Boston to create these open spaces right on their outside that are essentially public parks that can be used by both students and the adjacent communities. We were really happy with the results of this, but we really had higher aspirations. Like, we hope this is relieving mental stress, that this is actually a place of contemplation for students. And you kind of never get that assurance, or can't really know that. But then this started happening at the top of the hill. Students started stacking these stones, and it was quite a magical thing to see this, because it's like a built manifestation of like making this into a quiet kind of contemplative place. And not often do you get a kind of definitive, I don't know if you call it proof, but like reinforcement that what you did there achieved something you were trying to do, but sometimes you do. The next one we talk about is at Radcliffe, and this centers around walls. This is the Radcliffe Sunken Garden. I know probably most of you guys know a lot of these spaces, maybe this one in particular, but when you drive by on Garden Street, this is, I'm sure you guys know where Radcliffe is. This is the presentation of this garden. It's a rather continuous brick wall around the entire space, and looks a little bit foreboding. We worked on this whole master plan for Radcliffe Yard. We designed all the spaces here, but we really focused on this parcel called the Sunken Garden in the northwest corner, which sits right on Cambridge Common. And we saw this as a really unique and wonderful opportunity to create a flower garden in the public, maintained with the resources and the powers that Harvard University has. And we said, we got to really go for it in this space, take advantage of this opportunity. This is kind of sketches that we do, and they become a sketch like this kind of becomes a totem for me when we're designing the space and you're going through all the rigmarole of like value engineering, what's this space really about? Returning to a sketch you do early in the project helps remind you, this is what I hope it will be. And that's part of the way our studio works. And this is about what's about to happen in the Sunken Garden in a couple of weeks, or maybe just a week. This kind of white explosion of early spring ephemeral plants, either shad and star magnolia in bloom. And it was really designed as a harbinger of spring and really to celebrate after the long Boston winters coming out of the space. And as soon as this starts to happen, pretty early on, people start to congregate here and use this space. But it was really designed as an iris garden. Historically, it was an iris garden. We actually salvaged the irises from the original garden, stored them while the rest of this garden was built, and then brought them back. And here you see primarily Siberian iris in bloom, and really just a really lush planting of irises. And here, maybe a week later, these are called sugar blue. These are bearded German irises. And I didn't know before we did this that they had much scent at all, but it's like an incredibly well-scented kind of perfume that comes out of these. And that we were just, the way they kind of drape over these walls and kind of envelop you is really wonderful. And on the other side, you have a lot more sun, so you can add peonies, you can add baptisia, you can add roses, Japanese iris, and really extend that season out. It was ostensibly designed for the fellows and the scholars who have their offices in Byerly Hall, directly across postdoctoral fellows at Radcliffe, so they could spill out from that doorway, from their terrace into this garden, and think deep thoughts and just have contemplative space out there. And you can imagine maybe these are some of the fellows out there having their lunch and enjoying the restored fountain and the space. But not everyone saw it that way. This is my son Cooper 10 years ago. He doesn't look like this anymore. But he immediately saw this as like a raceway, speed track, something like that. He just started running around this fountain. And pretty soon after this space was built, kind of the word was out, and preschool groups started coming to this space and just seeing this really enclosed, beautiful garden and using this fountain became a real attractor and still is for kids. And people come here and read the newspaper on Sunday mornings and use it for all kinds of things. Going back to what's around it, it has this brick wall and kind of this intimidating gateway. So I just said to myself, how come this space is so well used and successful? And it has a couple things beyond this that are, I think, really help it out. One is this kind of funny, curious gate on the corner, this open window. And you see it when you walk by, inviting you up to that space to look in. You see it when you drive by on Garden Street. What's that? You can see right in there. But a bigger factor, I think, is probably the walls themselves. When you walk along the sidewalk, they're just at the right height. I went back and checked, they're 4'6". So you can see, at least I can, I mean, not everyone here, but it's a perfect height where you can like see how that world is enclosed and defined on the inside, but you can exist and walk along on the sidewalk and you can see both worlds at the same time. And what it drove home to me was the importance of the details in how a space is used. There's a portion of that wall where it's 5 feet high, and there it's a completely different experience. I think if these walls had been built 5 feet high instead of 4'6", would completely transform the use of this space. So I thought that was really kind of interesting. And it's been a great space, and people come in there and they're pretty comfortable and sometimes even a little too comfortable in this space, but we think that's pretty awesome. The last park I'm going to talk about is in Cleveland. This is a bigger park than these spaces. Some of these spaces I've shown you are parks, and some are, semi-public, semi-private, open spaces, but they all form an important part of the matrix of open space in the city of Boston. This is a park that is between Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights in the city, right outside the city of Cleveland. And when you're working on a public park like this, I find you're often working, especially when there's a park there and you're brought in to design a new park, you're working to design something in relation to and often opposition to a memory of what was there before. This is Horseshoe Lake Park, pretty beautiful. This is the way it looked 10 years ago. And surrounding this space are a number of really wealthy homeowners, big, beautiful 100-year-old homes that all used to have views out to this lake. But today it looks like this. And the reason it looks like this is because that lake was created by 150-year-old Shaker Dam. The Shakers built this dam to run a woolen mill, and sediment has been building up behind this masonry and earthen dam for 150 years, and it finally failed. And it failed a number of times, and they had to build an emergency breach through there and drain the lake. And this is what's left behind, all the sediment that's been building up for 150 years behind that dam. And not very attractive, of course, but more than that, it's extremely dangerous because this is soft mud, in some places 18 feet deep. So you have to keep people out of it so they don't go in there, and envision a way to transform this. So we were hired by the sewer district, the entity responsible for maintaining this, and told, how can you guys design this into a park that people are going to love as much as they loved that lake? As soon as we got there, we realized there was a very organized and well-funded resistance to the building of a new park in this space. All these homeowners wanted was to bring the park back. They even hired their own engineering team to come up with an alternative design, and said, this is what you guys need to do. So we had to fight against that. And the way we did it, of course, we went out into the space, we went out into the public, and this is the way we always work. We try and get people to sit down at the table and draw with us. Tell us your ideas. What excites you about this space? What do you guys envision for this space? At this meeting in particular, we had ecologists, we had hydrologists, we had historians, we had people from the sewer district. We spread out all around the park of these different workstations. But the opposition didn't take this lying down. They had picket lines, they had signs, they had people marching through the space, and they hired an airplane to fly around with a big banner behind Save the Lake through the whole activity. So it was challenging. Never have I worked on a park that people didn't want so much. But we really worked hard to engage the kids with Play-Doh. And this was kind of a particularly relevant exercise because we had 180,000 cubic yards of material to work with in this park, all that sediment. We had to keep it on site and make our landforms. And sometimes they came up with pretty interesting ideas. So, get inspiration from that. It's challenging, but it was fun. And another thing we did was we took people around the park to other places and tried to get them to really fall in love with other places. This was 60 acres we were dealing with, and the original park and lake were about 6 acres. So there's much more than just this lake, you guys. There's a wonderful forest here, and really get them to fall in love with the rest of the space. And then, of course, we went much further, and we popped up all over the place. We'd be in front of cafes and movie theaters and just grab people on the street, try and get them to sit down and draw with us and give us their ideas. We had online surveys, a series of community meetings, really trying to gather as much input as we could and try and convince people that there was more potential to this land than just trying to bring the lake back. It could be something better. And even, we were willing to put on an occasional costume like here to really get the input of kids, but also get their parents there, who are really an important constituent group. Finally, we got together and we had these big workshops in libraries where we had the residents come and build their own park. What we did is we gave them components of the park, certain water features, mounds. We said we have this much fill we have to deal with, and most importantly, gave them a budget, and we put a price tag on each one of these. And then they sat down at the table in groups of 6 and developed their own plans. Where do you want these elements? We gave them some advice, of course, as we were going around. But in the end, we ended up with like 50 full-scale plans of the park that the community wanted to build. And we just gleaned from that a lot of ideas of what was the most important elements that they wanted to see and spend their money on. And this is that sketch I showed earlier that we did during the process. Once we had all that information, we began to generate ideas. And this is a rough sketch, but you can see this kind of big mound up on the hillside. That's this promontory, and we developed a whole bunch of those to take care of that sedimentation, all that sediment, curving trails, accessible trails to get you down into the restored stream corridor, which is kind of represented on the right, and bike trails through the middle of the park, stepping stone pathways across the water, terraced landscapes up the hillside, etc. And we played with clay too, and we do this in a lot of our design projects where we just use clay as kind of a quick kind of 3D study material, looking at landform. And then we came up with this plan that incorporated a lot of these elements and became the driving design. Now, this is in process now. This park hasn't been built yet, and I'm not going to go through each one of these elements here in the plan, but I'll give you an idea. Of course, what we had to do after this was create images that help to sell this to the public. But what essentially we were dealing with here was a park that completely transforms with major storm events, from a small event where you have the restored Doan Brook in the upper left to what it looks like at a 100-year storm event, where we've created this tremendous floodplain for the river to expand and take up flood volume and help protect the watershed downstream of this. And you can see all the aspects in the different kind of flood events, how the shape and the character of it transforms. And the key here was we wanted to keep the circulation open throughout these storm events so people could see it, experience it, and that the park would transform week by week and month by month as these events came and went. And then we went into Rhino models and Lumion and started to develop these images of the park. Here's a more readable, legible image of that transformation. Here's an aerial of the park, and here's what it would look like with that 100-year storm event feeling up the whole valley. And you can see the circulation, kind of these arcs of circulation crossing from the community on one side of the park to the other, and this spine trail going through weaving through the middle of it, designed to stay open through these 100-year storm events. And then we started to create these evocative images of places of how people could come in and see these events. Here's an overlook terrace looking down into the restored stream corridor, where we saw this maybe being able to transform into a community gathering space for small events, or a pavilion here, which gets you to some of these constructed wetlands and gets you out into the middle of the park. Here's an image of one of those constructed wetlands. This is really 3 different lobes of the wetland. And you can see that walkway there down the middle. That's actually a divider. All this water on the right-hand side is the water coming from the community into these wetlands and getting filtered before it goes back into Doane Brook. And we had a little fun with these. We wanted to make it clear that they weren't just natural systems. These are man-made systems. So just a simple device of making these very distinct oval pools, which are pretty pure, that would emerge as the water receded and then transform into kind of crescent-shaped pools. And those pools would remain for 2 or 3 days as the water receded and went back into the ground. And then we'd get people down into the middle with a new bridge spanning where the old dam used to be that was removed, and down into the heart of the park itself with a multi-use trail with boardwalks, pathways, really giving people access to the full 60 acres along this restored river. But probably one of the most important aspects of this was a nature play area in the middle of the park that we developed. And here you can see this kind of crescent-shaped play space with mounds and gathering areas, and I'll show you some of the equipment. But the more important aspect is this meandering Doane Brook, which really kisses this nature play area in 2 spaces. It's very important for us for the river itself to become part of this nature play for kids coming into the space. Here's your more traditional kind of nature play running next to the brook, which had climbing structures, stumpery pathways through a lot of mounds of native planting, sand play. But it's really that aspect of coming through those mounds, down this scramble of rocks, down to the level of the water. And of course, we're working very closely with hydrologists who are telling us how much water is going to be there, how this river is going to function. But the idea that kids could come down, touch the water, run along the edge, cross it on stepping stones, explore the edge of it, it's really critical to us, because the hope is that these kids get to know this restored Doane Brook and really get to love this Doane Brook. And as they grow, that their values that are formed are ones about caring for natural systems and really wanting to get down and touch them. Just in light of this talk, though, all those wonderful things to design are really fantastic, and we're very hopeful that it's supposed to start construction in a year. It's always, you never know what's going to happen, but it seems to have a lot of momentum, and we've been able to convert a lot of those Save the Lakers into people who are now in favor of the new Doane Brook Park. But there's this one thing I just wanted to mention, and that's along South Park Boulevard, there's this kind of banal intersection which exists today. But the one thing that's notable about it, that's the park on the right, the community on the left. There's no crosswalks, there's no curbs, there's no sidewalks in the park at all. There's no way to get into that space. And this roadway on the left happens to lead directly to the public transit system, which takes you directly down into Cleveland, in the heart of Cleveland. So the people in this park were not all that interested in creating an accessible entrance here. It took a lot of arm twisting, but we finally got them to allow us to put a 3-way stop in here, some crosswalks. Again, this is the kind of element which is really going to expand the use of this park, allow people from the inner city to come out here and experience this. But it's the kind of thing that's kind of on a knife edge of political acceptance. So we're hopeful it's in there now. We hope it gets built. And that's I'm just going to wrap up. These are the 5 spaces I just talked about with you guys, and sort of those 5 elements. I think you maybe understand them a little bit more. And as I thought about it, is there any conclusion or summation? And after going back and looking at a bunch of these spaces, I think my conclusion is it's pretty much impossible to tell how a park is going to be used once it's open to the public. You really have no idea, no matter how much information you glean, how many public workshops you do. So really just the idea of making it as open as you possibly can to as many people as you possibly can, and know that it's going to change over time. It's about the best you can do with spaces like this. And that's it. And happy to take a few questions. If anybody has any. Yeah, shoot.
Thank you. I really appreciated what you said about how your firm deals with residential design as well as these larger conservation projects and other projects. And I was just wondering what the balance in the firm is between.
Sure. We actually have a pretty large residential practice. It's about 30% of the firm, and 30% of our work is institute. It varies, it fluxes depending with the market and the economy, but we usually maintain, sometimes it's up to 40% of our work. But it's a good chunk of the work that we do, and a lot of it is institutional work for universities and museums, and then a smaller percentage of it is for these public parks. They're a little harder to get, more competitive, and range at different scales, but we think it's an important part of practice and fun part of practice too. Sure.
You ever find your totem sketches in conflict with the democratized aspect of the design process?
Well, that's a good, complicated question. I think those totem sketches, they kind of sit in your subconscious, and it's often a reckoning that you have to, you always have to do a lot of reckoning with a vision that you have, especially for a public park. It's going to change. It's all about compromise. And I think you just have to kind of hope that you get some aspect of that in there, and hopefully the most important aspect of that kind of totem idea into the park, whether maybe for the sunken garden, it's the idea that it's a flower garden and doesn't become something that's just shrubs and lawn, that you can maintain a space, design a space, and then get enough support for it that people are willing to come out and weed and actually take care of that space. It's very rare. Or for Horseshoe Lake Park, lots going on in that sketch. Probably the most important thing for me was to create stepping stone pathways through the restored waterway. And the idea that that point where the people get in actual contact with the water, to me, is what's essential. So I think in response, it's just trying to save what the essential kernel of those sketches are as you go forward in the design process.
Skirting the edges of some of these political issues in the sense of safety, right? Nobody would have a kid past this point.
Right.
I'm curious whether you can identify design elements that either contribute to people's sense of safety or whether that's perceived safety.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's perceived safety, of course, and just fear of ideas of what's dangerous, particularly at Pine Tree. Probably not that dangerous. You're in Chestnut Hill in Boston. But it is a big public park. And I think it's, in many cases, it's pretty deeply ingrained that when you see a woods, especially a dense woods in your mind, that's not going to be a safe place, especially after dark. So elements that trigger that sense of safety. I think the other one, of course, is Mary Suhu Park, and the idea that there was a lot of homeless people camping out in half of this park, and whether there was actually going to be a problem with those people or not, as opposed to the people who were playing at the chess tables. I think it was, a little both. I can't speak too much for the Greenway Conservancy, but certainly there was this perceived threat of this population in that park the same time as I'm in there. I don't know what they're going to do. But, maybe that is a real threat. I don't know. I hear there was some incidents, so it's tough to tell. I'd say at Radcliffe, the idea of a wall around that. And I think that can work both ways. I think that was put up initially for the safety of women. It was designed as an all women's enclave. And in the end, I think that wall actually worked in the opposite way. Now it feels like, because it's a low wall, that it feels like you can go in there and be separated from the world, from the activity and the hubbub of Cambridge when you're in this sort of minimally walled space. There's been, some issues there with people coming and sleeping in that space, but not very many. So I think it's mostly that perceived sense of enclosure, which can work both ways.
Picture landscape architects, a pearl of wisdom. What would it be?
Pearl of wisdom. I think I'd say I feel very lucky to be a landscape architect, and having been able to build all of these things, particularly in the city that I love and I've grown up with. And it can be a very frustrating process to get things built. Things don't get built the way you want them to. 90% of the things you design don't get built at all. But I guess my pearl of wisdom is just in people that I've met, and in my life, the fact that there are places I can go to and now take my kids to that are physical is such a change, and so rewarding in today's world, especially when everything is so digital, and you often have a really tough time, like feeling like you've made a difference in the world, that your work is not to sound too, but concrete, is a reward that's really wonderful. And particularly landscape architecture, because every time you go back, it's going to have changed, and sometimes radically changed. Sure.
Especially for this midterm work.
Good.
So from all these projects, I was wondering, since we all learned something today, did you learn something in particular that maybe not going to be placed in any future project?
In particular, from all of these projects, I think the most poignant example is the project at Mary Suhu, and that there are people who need to be brought to the table early in the design process, who are marginalized and completely excluded in our society from a process like that. And that we have to figure out how to be better to reach out to some of those community members. And Mary Suhu was homeless people in that community. At Doan Brook, there was, I heard from people of color coming into that neighborhood that they just didn't feel safe in that space. And we had to try, and they didn't feel welcome. So they didn't come to the public meetings. So working harder to reach and identify and try and just be more perceptive of there are populations out here which don't get brought into this dialogue, and they can have they will have a huge impact on your park because they live here. How to reach those people is what I try and bring forward. Good friend of mine here, Jovi Cruces, is in the back, and we both went to Haverford College, and it was quite literally the trees at Haverford College. One day I was walking around, and we were both taking architecture classes together, and I looked around and I said, oh my God, that tree is different from that one. And not just like that one's a pine tree and that's an oak tree. That one is a different shape. It has a different character. It's like a different sculpture. It happened one day. And then I'm like, I have to learn more about this. Kind of went from there. Thanks.
I'm wondering how you manage to find a balance between some vegetation and you can call plants or roads.
Mhm.
Something that's more like harmony.
It's a great question. And I think our tendency as a landscape architecture profession, and me in particular, is that you feel like when you're designing that you are sculpting the earth. You're taking that clay, you're taking a knife, or you're in Rhino. I'm not in Rhino, but I'm working with someone in Rhino, and they're sculpting the earth. And you make this beautiful construction, and you think, that's it. This is a perfect thing. And you add the plants, and like that will sort of make the walls, but you always underestimate the impact of the plants. And especially because our profession, everything we design, unlike architecture, changes year by year by year. And it's the plants that really separate us from architecture, from urban planning, from really all other design fields. So I think that never underestimate the plants, I think is the key there. And you need to make it work. You need to make it safe. All those things are critical, and they involve the engineers and the math and everything you have to do with all the detailing. But it's the plants, and really not just the trees, but keeping flowers as a part of your tool palette is really important. And a lot of landscape architects kind of let that slide, or they don't learn that. There's so many thousands of kinds of perennials to learn. But we can see a lot of examples in the public landscape of how powerful they can be.
Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. I am intrigued by the two different studios that form your firm.
Yeah.
One is blue, one is urban. And I wonder, how did you come to that vision, and how do you use these two different places? Do you assign different projects to different studios? Or do you, as all the firm members, have to spend some time in the rural, some time in the urban studio? Finally, do you use the rural studio to do some research?
Yeah, good questions. Well, that rural studio is little more than a studio. I don't know if I said this, but Steve and Lauren Stimson actually live on that land. Their home is there. And Steve Stimson, right down the road, his father had a farm that's been in his family for, I don't know, 8 or 10 generations. It's an incredibly long time. So he was drawn back to the land, and that studio grew up from their desire to be on a working farm. And it is very much a working farm, and it's used both to grow trees. There's a nursery there, and we use more and more of those trees in our own work when we can. But we do experimentation there. We do mock-ups. We have little design competitions within the firm. In terms of more organized long-term research, we're just getting started with that, but we intend to continue to have that grow and bring lectures actually out. We have something called the Grange Hall there, and we've been bringing people out there to have lectures in that space and have art shows in that space. And people do have to go back and forth between the two studios.